Listen, there are moments in your relationships where someone pulls away and everything inside you starts to panic. You start telling yourself stories. They don't want me. I did something wrong. It's over. But the truth isn't in the story you tell yourself. It's in the psychology behind the behavior. Some people love deeply but fear deeply. They crave connection yet feel unsafe when it arrives. And when that fear activates, they retreat, not because they don't care, but because the intensity of caring overwhelms them. And here's the part most people never understand. Even when they step back, they are still connected to you. They check your energy. They feel your emotional temperature. They sense when you shift. Avoidants don't chase with their feet. They chase with their focus. They chase with their attention. They chase with their need to restore inner balance so they can return to you. But hear me now. Your power is not found in chasing after anyone who pulls away. Your power is in anchoring yourself. Because when you choose peace instead of panic, composure instead of chaos, that's when you become magnetic. That's when someone who fears closeness suddenly feels safe enough to take a step toward you. People don't respond to pressure. They respond to presence. They don't come closer because you demand it. They come closer because you embody something their soul recognizes as steady, grounded, and real. In every relationship, there is a divine principle at work. You teach others how to treat you by the way you treat yourself. If you collapse, chase, or lose yourself, you reinforce their fear that closeness equals suffocation. But when you stand tall, when you honor your worth, when you hold your boundaries, you create a space where they can return without feeling trapped. And make no mistake, they will return. Avoidants circle back when they feel safe. They approach when they trust the environment. They show up when they sense you're not trying to control them, fix them, or pull them into a space they're not emotionally ready for yet. So hear this truth. Your self-worth is not measured by someone else's moment of distance. Your value does not shrink because someone needed space. Your power does not fade because someone stepped back. You are the constant. You are the grounding force. You are the one who decides how you show up, calm, confident, and connected to your purpose. And when you rise into that version of yourself, the version who doesn't cling, doesn't collapse, doesn't diminish, you become irresistible to someone who once feared closeness. You become the safe harbor they didn't know they needed. You become the presence that invites them back, not through pressure, but through pure alignment. So stand in your strength. Honor your heart. Let your stability be the silent invitation that calls them forward. Because the moment you stop chasing what is running is the moment it begins to find its way back home. Distance doesn't mean disinterest. To someone who hasn't experienced or understood avoidant attachment, that idea sounds contradictory, even impossible. How could someone care deeply and yet step back at the very moment you feel closest? How could someone want you, value you, even love you, yet withdraw when things begin to feel emotionally intimate? But this is the paradox of the avoidant heart. Their distance is not always an indication of a lack of feelings. Often, it is a sign that their feelings are stronger than they know how to handle. For an avoidant, closeness activates something that lives beneath the surface, a fear of being engulfed, controlled, or losing themselves in the relationship. When emotional connection intensifies, their nervous system triggers an alarm. They don't think, I don't want this. It's more like this is too much, too fast, too uncontrolled. Their mind begins to weave old stories from past experiences, moments where vulnerability led to pain, intimacy led to disappointment, or relying on someone led to abandonment. To someone with an avoidant pattern, emotional closeness feels like stepping into a space where they could lose power, lose independence, or even lose the identity they built to protect themselves. So they retreat. Not because they're uninterested, but because the emotional activation is overwhelming. They create distance to breathe, to recalibrate, to regain their sense of control. It's not about you. It's about their internal world trying to regulate itself. And if you misunderstand that withdrawal, you may take it personally, interpreting their need for space as rejection, apathy, or indifference. But here's what's happening beneath the surface. Even as they step away, their mind doesn't detach from you. They are still thinking, still processing, still feeling. They may be quieter but not numb. They may be distant but not disconnected. Their retreat is a strategy, not a verdict. It's more like emotional self-defense than emotional abandonment. Picture someone who has spent years learning that relying on others is unsafe. When they meet someone who stirs something real inside them, someone they could imagine trusting, someone whose presence softens their armor, that very connection becomes a threat to their survival patterns. Their instinct is to protect themselves, not push you away. They pull back to evaluate, am I safe here? Will I lose myself here? Can I handle the intensity of this feeling? So distance, in this context, is a form of emotional troubleshooting. This is where most people misunderstand avoidance. They confuse space with disinterest. They assume silence means they don't care. But emotional overwhelm can look like detachment, even when the heart is fully engaged. They love from a distance, because up close feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory where they are no longer in control. When they retreat, they often think about what was said, what was felt, what could happen next. They analyze the dynamic. They replay moments. And paradoxically, this distance often reignites their connection to you. While they're away, their nervous system settles and clarity returns. They begin to miss you, value what you brought into their life, and feel drawn back, sometimes with even more intensity than before. The key is not to misinterpret the retreat as the end. The avoidant heart is wired differently. It approaches love through the lens of caution rather than surrender. The distance is simply the space they need to realign themselves. When you understand that their pullback is not a dismissal of you, but a step toward emotional equilibrium, you no longer feel threatened by it. You learn to hold your ground without chasing, collapsing, or panicking. You give them the room to breathe, which paradoxically invites them closer. In the avoidant world, distance is not the absence of care. It is their way of staying connected without losing themselves. Even when an avoidant partner seems to withdraw completely, there's almost always an invisible thread of attention they keep tethered to you. It's subtle, almost imperceptible on the surface, but profoundly active beneath it. Avoidants are often far more attuned than they appear. They may step back physically or emotionally, but they rarely disconnect mentally. Their distance isn't absence, it's observation. They watch, they assess, they feel out the environment to determine when, if ever, it's safe to re-engage. When avoidants pull away, they don't stop caring. In fact, many times they become more aware of you. They're checking the temperature of the connection from afar. They want to know if you're angry, hurt, chasing, calm, or indifferent. They won't ask directly because direct conversations about emotions feel risky. Instead, they use indirect methods, subtle cues, quiet monitoring, energetic checking to understand where you stand. They may check your social presence, your messages, your energy. They notice if you suddenly go quiet, if you maintain your routine, or if you seem emotionally grounded. They're paying attention to how you respond to their absence, not because they're manipulative, but because they're gathering emotional data. They need to know whether the connection still feels safe, whether you're stable, whether the relationship is drifting in a direction that could overwhelm them again. This monitoring may happen consciously or unconsciously. For many avoidants, it's instinctive. They have learned to track emotional cues as a way of preventing vulnerability from catching them off guard. They scan for emotional climate the way someone who grew up in a volatile environment scans for signs of tension. They're always reading the room, even when they're not in it. People often imagine avoidants retreat into nothingness, but the truth is the opposite. Their mind is active. Are they upset? Are they moving on? Do they still want me? Is the connection stable? Will they punish me for taking space? Will they demand more than I can give? These questions create a cycle of cautious curiosity. And even while distancing, they keep their attention on what you do next, because your behavior helps them determine their re-entry point. Your energy becomes a kind of emotional GPS for them. If you explode, chase, shame, or panic, it confirms their fear that closeness equals pressure. But if you stay steady, grounded, and warm without clinging, something softens inside them. They become curious again. They start drifting back. Avoidants move toward what feels emotionally safe and away from what feels overwhelming, and your response during their withdrawal tells them exactly which direction to go. But here is the part most people miss. Avoidants often feel more than they express. So instead of reaching out, they watch. Instead of asking, they scan. Instead of saying, I miss you, they observe your actions to feel reassured. Their quiet monitoring is their way of staying connected without exposing themselves emotionally. It's a substitute for vulnerability, a safer way to engage while maintaining their sense of control. They also check for consistency. Avoidants despise unpredictability because it threatens their internal stability. If you are consistent even when they step back, consistent in your energy, your boundaries, your self-respect, it begins to melt their defenses. They think, maybe this person won't overwhelm me. Maybe they won't disappear if I re-engage. Maybe I can trust this. Your steadiness becomes a beacon that guides them back. In many ways, an avoidant's silent monitoring is proof of how much you matter. If they didn't care, They wouldn't track you at all. Their attention reveals their attachment. Even if the expression is indirect, they may pull away physically, but emotionally, they lean in through awareness. Their distance is not detachment, it is a guarded form of presence. They watch from afar because watching feels safer than risking being seen. Your emotional stability becomes a quiet, yet powerful force that draws an avoidant partner in, often more effectively than any words, reassurances, or attempts to fix the connection ever could. Avoidants are not repelled by love. They are repelled by emotional intensity that feels unpredictable, overwhelming, or demanding. When someone approaches them with heat, urgency, or emotional pressure, their internal alarms activate and their instinctive response is to retreat. But when you embody calmness, self-possession, and groundedness, everything inside them relaxes. Their nervous system, which is constantly on guard against emotional engulfment, begins to trust the environment you create. For avoidance, safety doesn't come from closeness. It comes from the feeling that they have enough space to be themselves without being swallowed by the expectations of another person. When your energy is calm and self-contained, you send a powerful signal. You're not here to invade their world. You're here to coexist with it. And coexistence feels far safer to them than meshment. Your stability communicates something profound without you ever needing to say it. I am secure within myself. I don't need to control you, monitor you, or demand anything from you. I can hold my own energy without collapsing into yours. That kind of presence is rare, and avoidants feel drawn to it like a flame, not because it challenges, but because it soothes them. It gives them room to breathe, room to think, room to approach at their own pace. When you stop chasing and start grounding yourself, an interesting dynamic happens. Avoidants are highly sensitive to shifts in emotional tone. They may not respond to your emotional words, but they respond intensely to your emotional state. When you enter a place of internal steadiness, where you're not chasing, panicking, or trying to pull them back, they notice. And that shift creates an invisible gravitational pull. They sense, even from afar, that you have stepped into a version of yourself that feels safe, spacious, and non-reactive. This is not about playing hard to get. Avoidants are not attracted to emotional manipulation or artificial distance. They respond to authenticity, specifically the authenticity of someone who is deeply rooted in their self-worth. When your value doesn't waver based on their closeness or distance, they feel less pressure to manage your emotions. They feel less responsible for your inner world. And when they feel less responsible for managing someone else's feelings, they suddenly have more capacity to explore their own. Your emotional stability gives them a sense of predictability. Predictability may sound boring to some people, but for an avoidant, it is the foundation of safety. When they sense that your emotions are not volatile, that your mood doesn't swing based on their actions, that you won't punish them for needing space, they begin to trust you in ways they don't trust many people. They begin to associate you with peace instead of pressure. And in that peace, something shifts inside them. They feel permission to move toward you instead of away. Stability doesn't just attract avoidance, it liberates them. It frees them from the fear that intimacy will turn into obligation, conflict, or emotional chaos. Your groundedness becomes an open door instead of a tether. It invites them to approach on their own terms. Most avoidants long for connection, but they fear the cost of it. Your stability reassures them that connection with you doesn't come with the hidden price of losing themselves. And this is where they begin to chase, not with desperation, but with curiosity, interest, and a sense of safety. Your stability becomes the silent message that tells them, you're free to be yourself. You're safe to come closer. I'm not here to cage you. I'm here to meet you. And that message is the most compelling force of all. Their silence is often misunderstood, but for an avoidant, withdrawing is not an act of punishment, indifference, or emotional abandonment. It is an act of self-protection. When emotions rise, when intimacy deepens, when vulnerability feels too raw or too exposed, their internal system becomes overwhelmed. They don't pull back because they don't care. They pull back because caring too much activates fears they've spent years trying to outrun. Their silence is a shield, not a sentence. It is their way of finding safety inside themselves before they feel safe enough to be connected with someone else. Avoidants often grew up in environments where expressing needs or emotions didn't lead to comfort. It led to disappointment, dismissal, or even danger. So they learn to regulate themselves by retreating inward, shutting down, minimizing emotions, and becoming self-contained. When they feel the threat of emotional overload, silence becomes their refuge. It gives them the space they need to organize their thoughts, detach from the intensity, and recenter. It's the only strategy they trust when vulnerability feels too sharp, too unpredictable, or too consuming. While you might interpret silence as rejection, avoidants experience it as a necessary pause. Their nervous system needs space to recalibrate. Emotionally, they feel like they're drowning, and breathing requires solitude. Imagine trying to build connection while simultaneously feeling like your sense of independence, identity, or stability is being threatened. That tension is overwhelming. Silence is their life raft until they can swim again. Their quiet isn't empty. There is always something happening beneath the surface. They are thinking, analyzing, remembering conversations, replaying moments, and assessing how they feel. Silence is where they process what they're not yet ready to express aloud. It's not that they don't want to talk. It's that they don't know how to talk without feeling exposed. Silence shields them from the vulnerability of saying something too emotional, too revealing, or too honest. Avoidants fear judgment. They fear disappointing someone. They fear being responsible for another person's emotional state. But more than anything, they fear being swallowed by someone else's feelings, especially if they already feel overwhelmed by their own. Their silence is an attempt to avoid conflict, emotional chaos, and vulnerability that feels too heavy. They step back to prevent a situation that feels emotionally too much, even if what you're offering is love, reassurance, or connection. What most people don't realize is this: avoidants don't want distance. They need it. There is a difference. Wanting distance would mean they feel nothing. Needing distance means they feel so much that they must retreat to manage it. Silence is a coping mechanism to regulate the emotional intensity they aren't equipped to handle in real time. And while they are silent, they are still connected to you. They often feel guilty, confused, and torn between their desire for closeness and their instinct to protect themselves. They wonder if they hurt you. They question whether they're capable of offering what you want. They worry that they are too much work or too complicated to be loved. Silence becomes the space where they wrestle with their internal conflict. When you respond to their silence with pressure, panic, or demands for immediate connection, their fear spikes. But when you respond with calm, steadiness, and emotional self-control, their internal world softens. You're no longer a source of emotional intensity. They no longer need silence to protect themselves from you. And when the silence no longer feels necessary, they begin to come forward again, often quietly at first, then more consistently. Their silence isn't an indicator that they've checked out. It's their way of ensuring they don't lose themselves in the process of trying to stay connected. It's a protective pause, not a final decision. Their quiet is the space in which they gather the strength to come back. Consistency is one of the greatest hidden magnets for an avoidant partner, not because it overwhelms them with love or demands, but because it creates the emotional predictability their nervous system desperately needs. Avoidant individuals are not allergic to connection. They are allergic to emotional chaos. They retreat not when they feel cared for, but when they sense instability, unpredictability, or a sudden shift in emotional tone that feels threatening. Consistency becomes the antidote to this fear. It signals safety. It signals steadiness. It signals that the relationship is a place where they won't be surprised, pressured, or emotionally hijacked. Avoidants often grew up in environments where emotional expression was inconsistent, sometimes rewarded, sometimes ignored, sometimes met with negativity or confusion. As a result, inconsistency triggers old wounds. It reminds them of past experiences where closeness felt dangerous or unreliable. But consistency, calm energy, predictable behavior, steady communication, grounded emotional responses cuts through that fear and creates a new pattern in their nervous system. It allows them to slowly unwind the belief that relationships are inherently destabilizing. What people often misunderstand is that consistency with an avoidant isn't about constant attention or daily reassurance. That would overwhelm them. It's about the quality of your presence, not the quantity. It's about the emotional GPS you radiate. When your reactions remain centered and your words align with your actions, you create a field of trust that avoidants can relax into. They need to know that if they step forward, they won't be met with volatility. And if they step back, you won't crumble, lash out, or abandon the connection in retaliation. Consistency also means boundaries, clear ones. Avoidants feel safest when they understand what to expect from you and what you expect from them. They dislike guessing games. They fear emotional traps. But when your boundaries are expressed calmly and upheld steadily, they begin to see you as someone they can trust. Your boundaries tell them, I can handle myself. I'm not seeking to control you. I'm responsible for my own emotions. That is incredibly attractive to someone who fears being responsible for another person's emotional world. When you are consistent, the avoidant doesn't have to spend energy analyzing your reactions or defending themselves against potential emotional demands. Instead, they can simply exist. And in that existence, closeness becomes more possible. Consistency signals that you are emotionally reliable, not because you cling, but because you embody stability. You don't fluctuate based on their behavior. You don't overreact to their need for space. You don't reward closeness with intensity or punish distance with withdrawal. You remain steady, and that steadiness becomes magnetic. Avoidants are hypersensitive to shifts in tone, energy, and expectation. They notice when you suddenly become anxious, when you begin seeking validation, or when you subtly pressure them to meet emotional needs they're not prepared to handle. But they also notice when your emotional presence remains calm, warm, and grounded. They feel the difference. Consistency becomes a signal that they can relax their defenses. It tells them that they won't be suffocated or criticized if they come close. Over time, your consistent energy begins to shift their internal wiring. They start associating you with safety instead of intensity. They begin to trust that you will not demand that they move faster than they can. They start believing that the connection won't threaten their autonomy. And the moment they feel these things, the dynamic changes. Avoidance turns into curiosity, distance turns into openness, hesitation turns into small, steady steps toward intimacy. Your consistency allows them to access parts of themselves they usually keep locked away. It creates a stable emotional landscape where vulnerability feels less like danger and more like possibility. They don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be predictable in your presence, not in your patterns of approval, but in your emotional groundedness. When you embody that, avoidants begin to feel safe enough to approach, engage, and eventually trust. In the end, consistency isn't just something that attracts avoidants, it transforms them. It invites them into a space where they no longer need to protect themselves so fiercely. It becomes the silent assurance that they can bring their authentic self into the relationship without fear of losing control, losing identity, or losing safety. Consistency is the bridge between their fear and their desire for connection. And you build that bridge one grounded moment at a time. They return when they feel safe, not pressured. This single truth reshapes everything you think you understand about avoidant partners. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, the need for emotional freedom isn't a preference. It's a requirement for survival. They're not avoiding you, they're avoiding the feeling of being trapped, judged, or consumed. And when closeness begins to feel like a demand rather than a choice, their instinct is to retreat. But the moment the pressure dissolves and safety replaces urgency, something inside them opens. They begin to move forward, not because you chased them, but because you didn't. Avoidants crave connection, just like anyone else, but they must arrive at it through their own timing, their own pace, and their own internal process. When they feel monitored or expected to respond in a certain way, their nervous system floods with anxiety. Pressure, even subtle pressure, activates old fears, the fear of losing independence, the fear of disappointing someone, the fear of being swallowed by emotional needs they cannot meet. This pressure makes them step back, not because they want distance, but because they need to protect themselves from emotional overload. But when you step out of that energetic stance, when you release the urgency, the chasing, the emotional tugging, they feel something radically different. Room, space, breath. They feel the freedom that allows them to evaluate their feelings without fear. And in that freedom, their heart begins to thaw. Safety to an avoidant means that the relationship does not threaten their sense of self. It means they can express their thoughts without being interrogated. It means they can take space without being confronted. It means they can come closer without being pulled into emotional intensity they're not ready for. When safety is present, their guards lower. Their emotions surface, and their desire for closeness, often buried under layers of fear, begins to reemerge. What creates this safety? Your energy. Your emotional self-control, your willingness to allow them to come to you instead of forcing connection. When you embody calmness instead of urgency, acceptance instead of expectation, and presence instead of pursuit, their nervous system relaxes. They start feeling drawn to you, not because you demanded closeness, but because you created the environment where closeness feels possible. Avoidants associate pressure with danger. Pressure feels like losing control. It feels like being responsible for someone else's emotional world, which overwhelms them. The more pressure they feel, the more they withdraw. It is not personal, it is psychological survival. But safety feels like permission. Permission to explore, permission to feel, permission to return without fear of being confronted or smothered. When they feel safe, they begin to re-engage in small but meaningful ways. They respond quicker. They initiate conversation. They ask questions. They share more of themselves. Their desire to connect resurfaces because the threat has disappeared. And even though they may not articulate it, they know when an environment feels emotionally secure. They gravitate toward it instinctively. Safety is also created when you maintain your sense of self. When you respect your boundaries, honor your worth, and keep your emotional world regulated, you communicate a message that avoidants deeply need to feel: you are not responsible for my happiness. I am whole within myself. That message frees them. It removes the fear that getting close to you means carrying the weight of your emotional needs. It reassures them that intimacy is not a burden but a choice. Ironically, the less you try to pull an avoidant close, the closer they feel comfortable becoming. When you stop reaching with desperation and begin reaching with calm, their defensive system no longer detects a threat. You offer connection without attachment anxiety. You offer presence without pressure. You offer love without emotional chaos. Avoidants return when connection feels like an invitation, not an obligation. They return when they sense mutual respect, emotional balance, and the absence of force. They return when they know they can step forward without being punished for stepping back. And here's the deeper truth: they want to return. Their withdrawal is rarely about a lack of desire, it's about emotional overwhelm. When the overwhelm dissolves and they feel grounded in their autonomy, the desire comes back online. They seek you. They remember why they felt connected to you in the first place. Their fear transforms into curiosity, their distance transforms into approach, and their hesitation transforms into engagement. Your ability to create safety through your energy, your boundaries, your stability, and your willingness to let them come toward you at their pace is what brings them back. Not pressure, not pursuit, not emotional intensity. They return when they feel safe, because safety liberates them to feel. And once they can feel without fear, they naturally find their way back to you. Your self-worth is the ultimate catalyst because it sets the emotional tone of the entire connection. Whether it thrives, collapses into insecurity, or transforms into something deeper and more powerful. With avoidant partners, this truth becomes even more profound. They are not drawn to people who abandon themselves for love. They are not pulled in by those who chase, plead, or mold themselves into the shape they think will be accepted. Those behaviors create emotional intensity, pressure, and anxiety, everything that activates the avoidant's fear response. What draws them in, what disarms their defenses, what quietly invites them closer, is your unshakable sense of worth. Self-worth is not arrogance. It is not distance for the sake of appearing strong. It is the quiet, steady knowing that you are enough, without needing someone else's attention, approval, or presence to validate you. When you stand in your worth, you shift the entire dynamic with an avoidant partner. Suddenly, they no longer feel the weight of being responsible for your happiness. They no longer sense that you will collapse if they pull back. They no longer fear that closeness with you means emotional babysitting. Instead, they experience something radically different: space, freedom, and safety. Your self-worth sends a powerful message: I value you, but I do not need to lose myself to love you. That message is the medicine to the avoidant heart. They have spent their lives believing that relationships require sacrifice of personal identity, autonomy, or emotional independence. But when they meet someone who embodies self-worth, that belief is challenged. They realize connection doesn't have to mean losing themselves. They realize intimacy can exist without drowning, and that realization is what makes them approach instead of retreat. When you operate from a place of worthiness, you no longer chase them to fill a void. You no longer interpret their distance as proof that you are inadequate. You no longer try to convince them to choose you. Instead, you become naturally centered. You respond with calm. You hold your boundaries with grace. You speak with clarity rather than emotion-driven urgency. And this emotional maturity becomes magnetic to an avoidant, because it is the one thing that quiets their internal alarm system. Self-worth also changes the way you interpret their behavior. When you feel solid within yourself, you don't spiral when they take space. You don't assume silence means rejection. You don't collapse emotionally because you know your value is not contingent on their level of availability. This steadiness is what keeps you aligned. It prevents you from slipping into anxious patterns that push avoidance further away. Instead, your groundedness becomes the foundation upon which their trust can grow. And trust is everything to an avoidant. Without it, they stay locked behind emotional barriers they built long before you came into their life. But your self-worth gives them something they rarely believe they can have, a relationship that doesn't demand they sacrifice their emotional safety, a relationship where they can be human, flawed, inconsistent, scared, and still respected, a relationship where they can show up slowly without being rushed or judged. Your self-worth also models something they often struggle to access within themselves. Avoidants frequently carry deep feelings of unworthiness. They don't believe they are good enough to be loved in a healthy way. They often assume the closer someone gets, the more likely they are to be discovered as inadequate. But when they witness your self-worth, not through words but through behavior, it reflects back a version of worthiness they can begin to internalize. You become a mirror that shows them a new possibility. Love can be safe. Love can be balanced. Love can exist without self-erasure. This doesn't just attract them, it heals them. It slowly, gently rewires the internal belief that connection equals danger. It transforms the relationship from a battlefield into a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, the avoidant begins to take emotional risks. They initiate more. They communicate more. They become more consistent. Not because you demanded it, but because your self-worth created the emotional environment where it felt safe to emerge. Your self-worth doesn't just pull them in. It invites the best version of them to step forward. It becomes the grounding force that turns fear into trust, distance into curiosity, and hesitation into connection. And while an avoidant may not express this in words, they feel it deeply. They feel the difference between someone who seeks validation from them and someone who stands firmly in their own light. They feel the difference between pressure and peace, and they are drawn again and again to the energy that makes connection feel like a choice rather than a trap. This is why your self-worth is the ultimate catalyst. It doesn't chase. It doesn't cling. It doesn't collapse. It simply is, steady, grounded, magnetic. And in that presence, avoidants find the one thing they never expected to find in love, a place where they don't have to run. Thank you for sharing this space with me today. Your growth, openness, and intention truly matter. Goodbye for now, and may clarity, strength, and peace continue to guide your journey forward.